uh, is David? Yeah, David's here. He's got to
He's on his phone.
say an introductory word. He said, I don't think it's going to be necessary. And
Well,
has everyone been well this week? There been more
Good
and
here.
more of you getting inoculations.
Yep.
Out here in
Great.
California, they hardly started.
We get our second shot next week. Robbie, we get our second shot next week.
Wonderful.
Same here.
That's great news.
second shot Friday.
We've got a mess here in St. Johns County. It's been just crazy, but apparently there's a breakthrough here, and the feds are bringing some stuff in, and I think the next month or so it'll really start to accelerate. And I've been reading a good deal. Apparently, this doesn't mean that we can all go to a big, great big
Go out dancing.
party. Hmm?
Go out dancing. We can't yet.
Well, again, I think there's going to have to be some moderation and masks and what have you, because not everyone is going to be vaccinated, and it is possible, from what I'm reading, to contract it, but it's again like when you has to get the flu shots. If you did catch something, it was much milder than if you didn't have it. So while we won't have 100% openness and back to the good old days for a while, at least we won't have this terrible, terrible threat hanging over our heads. So I'm looking forward to that.
Everybody see the governor at River Garden today?
No,
Yeah.
Just did see the tail end of it.
tell
Yeah,
me about it.
at River Garden today.
Well, David, if you would like to kick this off, I've got everybody in the room muted except for you and Rabbi. So if you'd like to introduce him, we can get going.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Sellen, a member of the Adult Education Committee. Tonight we're going to have the second of three classes on the Jewish experience in the Civil War. Our presenter is our adjunct Rabbi Fred Raskind. Rabbi Raskind is retired but generously donates time to Temple. He did his research on the roles of Jews during the Civil War when he was on sabbatical. We are one of many beneficiaries of his work, and we thank you in advance. Rabbi, I turn it over to you.
Well, good evening. Yes, and I would like to hear after we're concluded, or we have a few minutes at the end, about what the governor said and what's going on at River Garden, because it's certainly important and interesting and relevant. Okay, so I had a question mark. I wasn't sure, and I thought about it. The first time or two that I've done this series, tonight's presentation I did finally. I did that as the third. And what would be the third, I did a second. But honestly, rethinking, slight revisions, I felt that we talk a little bit more about some of the issues tonight and the religious experience, observance, things that are concerns of Jewish life and of Jewish issues. And of course, we'll get into order number 11 a little bit. We'll get into the chaplaincy controversy perhaps a little bit. And that's that. So, but the next session is a lot more fun. The next session, I delve into some personalities, Jewish personalities, and some are very, very interesting indeed. And some are just wild. And I mean, I found that the most fascinating part of the whole discussion. So in 2 weeks, I think it's 2 weeks, Jack, if I'm not mistaken, February 8th is the third and final, yes. And so that one will be a fun way to go and kind of leave us with a sense of who these people, as people, and what their experiences were. I just concluded, I have a little more time tonight. I just concluded reading a review because honestly, I have to confess to you, though I've been in this fair state a number of years in Vero and then down in South Florida, and then of course at Yum from 2013. So I've been around the block here, and not like some of you folks, but I know Florida a bit. And I have to confess, one thing I did not do was prepare something about the role of Jews in Florida in the Civil War. I mean, that's kind of relevant. Part of it was, and I was accurate about that, it was a bias, and part of it was accuracy. Because if you go back to the Civil War and 1860, there were a lot of Jews in Florida. I mean, there weren't a lot in the country, but there were even fewer in Florida. And Florida then, and there were the Floridas, East Florida, West Florida, capital St. Augustine, capital Pensacola, Spanish, the British. We down here in St. Augustine are really plugged into all of that stuff. And I know many of you are, and I know that the history of Jews in Florida really begins with the Jews in Pensacola and Jackson. So that's an interesting history, but there ain't a lot of it before during the Civil War. Much of it was very embryonic, and much of it occurred after the Civil War. So, having said that, I did take a look at some of a little bit of literature. I found a couple of interesting facts, and I found the book that I recommend by Robert Rosen, we'll be mentioning. There were some counter criticisms that, well, he downplayed anti-Semitism of Jews in the South, and he didn't analyze this and that. So, scholars go at it, and we learn from all sides. But there really isn't a whole lot. There's David Lee. We'll talk about him next time. And I was hoping to find perhaps at least a couple of Florida soldiers, and I think I may be on to one or two. But the number of Jews in Florida at the time was minuscule. In 1850, 1860, there couldn't have been 100 Jews in the whole area. I don't think there were less. And virtually no synagogues or so. Jewish life was very embryonic. So that's just by way of a preliminary conversation. But tonight we're going to talk about two things really: how Jews managed and practiced religion during the war, that those did, observance, both as soldiers in the field and on the home front. The second topic is related to the first, and that's the chaplaincy controversy. Okay. I like to underscore by kind of recapping and pointing out from our last session, to underscore the context which all of this was happening. And I have to clear up a couple points, and I probably will stop for a question or two if you have any. The big one is, and this is what the whole Civil War was about, states' rights, sectionalism, agrarian, rural. It was about slavery. That is the key issue upon which all the others were connected. Slavery was economics. Slavery was business. Slavery was culture. These were patrician, and by the way, I'm not taking any kind of a statement here that I think this is good. I don't think the Confederacy was good. And as I debated with my conservative son in college, it's a good thing the South didn't win the war, on one reason only. And we have facts. I think we mentioned it last time. England, France, and Russia were talking about entering into this and fixing the problem. In other words, we'd be speaking French down here and English in the Midwest and Russian on the West Coast. So had the country split, in my unexpert political opinion, down the road, we would have had not only 2 countries, would have had 0 countries. But that's for you to clear up. But slavery, and that's I think something we should kick around a little bit. In my interview with Robert Rosen, the attorney from Savannah, and author of the book, The Jewish Confederates, he raised the question of Savannah Jewish slaveholders. He said, and this was news to me, his research indicated that the number of slaves that were held by freed blacks in the South, there were a few, was 3 times the number of slaves held by Jews. Now, I don't think there's anybody who's going to say, well, if you have 1 slave, it's bad. It's not right. But we have to think what's going on at the time. I think one axe I have to grind is that we cannot, whether it's this or any other topic or any other issue, we cannot go back to 1920 or 1860 or 1790 and project back our feelings, our values, our views, and our history without understanding where they were then. Again, not that they're right and they're right for them and we're right for us, but we've got to take that into account when looking at it. Because again, I'm going to assume that there's probably 0 members in Havat Chesed who think slavery is a good idea. At which point, usually, and I make some kind of a comment, then of course, unless you're, the husband, in which case that's sort of slavery has survived to today, good humor. And of course, wives have always complained that that's sort of the job description. Do the work. Okay, so the point is, Jews are puzzled. When I gave this course in Hagerstown, they were just really kind of very upset about the idea of Jews owning slaves. Rosen said most Southerners did, or they supported it. And that's why they won the war. Does anybody want to jump in, make a comment, question?
I have a comment about the Jews in Florida when you said there were so few of them.
In 1850 and 1860.
Right. It was because air conditioning hadn't been.
Well, yes.
yet.
You made that as a joke, and with humor, there's often a kernel of truth, as you folks know. I was reading about Pensacola and the early history of, just kind of, it's time to start getting into that a little bit more in my place. And again, as we know, there were more Jews in Jacksonville in 1930 and 1940 than in Miami. And part of it was air conditioning. When air conditioning and the highways came in and segregation, and it changed. I was in Greenville, South Carolina in 1972. That was before Jimmy Carter. And I saw it. I saw the changes. And now you could live in the South. Whereas cities like Jacksonville, they always had a kind of a moderate size, but it operated differently. You couldn't function. And we're talking about Jews of the South, the Ely Evans book, the North Carolina. You had to conduct yourself differently than when you're in a northern or large Midwestern, West Coast city. But yeah, absolutely. The weather had a lot to do with it. And that's my thought on that. Anybody, somebody else? Oh, we've got Jack had his hand up. Jack, unmute yourself. Unmute. Stop. Unmute.
Kim,
There you go.
Jewish people have always been a minority, and the best, especially in the South, when there's fewer and fewer than there are in New York, Boston, and Baltimore, it was to get along, you go along with the status quo. And that's what it is. Most Jews in the South were merchants, traders, and merchants. To get along, you go along with the thing and don't rock the boat.
I'm going to react to that. I think you're absolutely right, but I would only suggest that that's true not only in the South, and what you say is true, but also in small communities in the North. If you're running that same store in Western Massachusetts or Maine, and we have roots in Maine, where the number of Jews is minuscule, you have to not stand out in a negative way, cause controversy. You can't do that and survive socially, civically, and most fundamentally economically. Somebody else, John? Did you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. It's from a documentary my wife and I watched a few years ago because she does have relatives in Mississippi, in Greenville.
Ah,
And the film was called Delta Jews. It actually included some of her family member. Yeah, you saw it. Okay.
yeah.
And they were reminiscing about the civil rights era in the early 60s. And one of the comments made is they took in a number of freedom riders who were Jewish, like Goodman, unfortunately, the young man who was killed.
Yeah.
But there was a little bit of friction going on there because they pointed out to the people who had come in from, quote, north of the Mason-Dixon line, when you leave, we still have to live here.
That's right. That's true.
Okay.
By the way, about Greenville, my colleague, Fred Davidow, grew up there. I'm sure your wife knew him or his dad, David. I never knew his dad, Dave.
It's her cousin's family. So
Well, I guess she does know them. Man, it was a good.
Well, just out of
Yes.
interest, though, that nice Southern author Shelby Foote
Yes,
is Jewish.
you don't mean it.
His
Really?
mother, Rodenstock.
Oh, he's very good. Did he do some of the Civil War
He
stuff?
did. He did the 3-volume set. Yes, that's what.
Well,
Fantastic writing. If
I
you're
remember him particularly in a couple of these incidents, and then we'll get off these trivia things, folks. But
okay.
I'm enjoying myself. When I enjoy myself, I know I'm not working hard. But I believe of course, we lived in Hagerstown, and we'd go at least whenever folks came into town up to Gettysburg. And if you haven't been to Gettysburg, it is just an experience. And I think we bought a tape. You have a tour where you can go and tape.
Yes.
And you go to a spot, you stop, and they describes it. I think he's quoted in that.
Yeah. Oh, he did a great monologue.
Yeah, terrific.
All right.
So, all right, if there's no more, let's roll on. Rosen maintained that Savannah Jews enjoyed about equal status with their Christian peers. And this is why Jonathan Sarna, the great Jewish scholar, he's at Brandeis and a Reform rabbi, he says that Rosen played down anti-Semitism in the South. But I think Rosen's right on. And there's another critique that is social, and scholars, they have to kind of go back and forth on this stuff. He said that Savannah Jews were at least of equal status with their Christian peers, even more than in any other city in the South, but certainly more so than in the North. And that's part of why I concentrated on Jews of the South and on the Confederacy. I will tell you, in the 6th grade, there was that time when Civil War hats became a fashion for kids, and you could choose. And I, of course, took a Union hat, needless to say. But that is part of it. The sociology was different. The tiny number of Jews were well ensconced. They were well-to-do merchants. They were prominent many in civic offices before and during and after the war, and not so much so in the North. So I think there's a sociology here that we should know about. And Rabbi Saul Rubin, who wrote the book Third to None, and he was my predecessor in Greenville, and he was in Savannah for a while, and Dr. Bert Korn, who was a professor and was at McFisrael in Philadelphia, we've talked about him, they both concur. So that's part of the demographic. Who are these people? How do they make their living? How do they fit into society? All of these demographic and sociological things. And I'd like to specifically call to mind two Civil War Jews. And the reason I brought that out is because it was relevant, and I'm probably obligated to do some more research on the early history of this temple and people who may have had ancestors or sons who were in the war. But there was Louis Mertz of Georgia who was buried in Antietam, and then A.F. Wolf of Texas was wounded for the third time at Antietam and died in a federal POW hospital and is buried in the Confederate cemetery. It's a big Confederate cemetery with some Union soldiers in it, right near Hagerstown, Maryland. So remembering that Maryland was a border state and a very interesting place, was a slave state. If you know the story, Federals were worried when secession started that Maryland was going to secede. So Lincoln sent troops, surrounded the capital in Annapolis, which is the capital, and so they weren't able to secede. As I said to my congregants at the time, where is Abraham Lincoln when we need him more than ever? But that's tongue in cheek, perhaps. But and that's a very interesting place. And again, without too much military detail, there was a great campaign in the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley. Lieutenant General Stonewall Jackson. And at one of the battles, I think it was at Winchester, there were two companies of Maryland Gray fighting against, in the same battle, two companies of Maryland Blues. So that reflected Maryland and its tenuous status. And if you know much about Confederate history, military history, the Southern flag had 15 stars. There were only 12 Confederate states. Does anyone know who the other 3 states were? You can guess. Jack's got one. Unmute, Jack. Unmute. We can't hear you. Unmute. There you go.
Missouri and Maryland.
Perfect. Perfect. And then, of course, West Virginia seceded from Virginia. But that's with us 3 because they felt they were slave states, but they did not secede any of the 3. But it was always very tenuous. There were loyalists in both. There were loyalists in the South. East Tennessee was heavily pro-Union and opposed to secession. And
Missouri was the same way.
And yes, exactly. So I guess what we have to do is look at a little bit of nuance and not think left and right and black and white and all and nothing. There was very complex and confused and conflicted. And that's why it was as tragic as it was. So the main subject, how is religion practiced on the home front and also by Jewish troops in the field? What do they do? Again, reminder, the organized Jewish community of 1860s, while it had expanded a good deal from 1850, was relatively limited. And except for major cities and maybe some small embryonic congregations here and there were no other synagogues in 1865. An essay on the early ways of Jewish migration to Maryland, and that's a good example, suggests that there were 2 reasons why Pennsylvania cities, York and Lancaster, thrived, but few Jews moved into Maryland. The first was political, legal and punitive repression of non-Christian religions. Did you know that it wasn't until, and we think of Maryland as this urban, liberal, blue, democratic state, and but it was a slave state then. It's come a long way since. And it wasn't until after 1830 that Maryland Jews could hold office or even vote. Interesting. Second, Maryland was composed almost entirely of small farms. So again, most Jews, as you pointed out earlier, were merchants, traders. They needed employment in large towns as well as a community of nearby Jews for services and Jewish life. So they avoided Maryland up until mid 1800s. The second factor helps explain why the Jewish community of nearby Virginia, which of course was certainly a heavy Confederate state, had a tolerance history since Jefferson. There was a kind of a moderate view. In all the literature, there are constant and extensive references to
I think Rabbi's froze.
Yeah, I think we're losing him. Unmute, Rabbi. There
I'm
you go.
done. Okay.
You're back.
Now you're going to hear me. Let me see if I can see me. This stuff, we had a funeral in St. Augustine today on Zoom, and for the most part, it went well, but the stuff does come in and out. Now, can you see me here? I don't.
We can see you, Rabbi.
Okay. Get to the gallery view. There we go. I like the gallery view. Yeah, so again, for these small groups, but for the most part, the congregational Jewish community in the whole mid-Atlantic area, between Pittsburgh, between Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, Baltimore and Richmond. That's it. But in the South, Jewish congregations flourished earlier. There were South Carolina synagogues in Charleston, Georgetown, Sumter, and Columbia, but except for Charleston, they were much smaller. And of course, as I mentioned, Florida was very sparsely settled, and it was mainly in the Panhandle and St. Augustine and Pensacola. And again, I need to do a little more research, but for the most part, in 1860, whatever Jewish life there was in Duval and in Jacksonville and even in Yulee County, it was scant. There was no national institutional American Judaism then, none. So, okay, what were their religious issues? Well, of course, the war meant that most of the young men were off fighting and dying. There were fewer marriages, fewer births, and so on, the demographics of war, domestic civil war. Second, money was scarce. The newly appointed Jewish chaplain for the Washington area traveled to northern cities to help raise funds to help Jewish soldiers wounded in battle in the DC hospital, and he found very little help. And like today, many small and not so small congregations saw their priorities as almost exclusively local. But other congregations were overwhelmingly generous. Much of the literature talks about the details of relief and food and clothes and bandages for Jews in the military and for citizens too. In 1865, there were no matzah in much of the South because there were no means for baking. Now, this is almost at the end of the war, 5 years into brutal fighting and dying. The New York Jewish community shipped 3,000 pounds of Pesach food, and Philadelphia 2,000 pounds. Rabbi Saul Rubin of Savannah's Mikveh, Israel, he wrote in his book Third to None, the saga of Savannah Jewry, that in the South, where the economy was ruined, a whole way of life disappeared, and it took years to recuperate. It wasn't just gone with the wind and the plantations. It was Jewish life and the embryonic synagogues that were in communities that were trying to form and grow. What happened during this time? What did congregations do while the war raged? Well, like us this past year and past years, they carried on, often as best they could. Services were held, classes were taught, funerals and life cycle events conducted. As part of this experience, I was in the library of the Venerable Georgia Historical Society, which is, by the way, among the oldest in the country, because Savannah's Mikveh Israel had sent all of its archives and records there for preservation and catalog. I held a leather-bound volume with handwritten notes of Mikveh Israel's board meetings during the times. The notes for 1860 and 1861 are on one page only and 2 lines more. Fewer meetings, distracted by war, only 2 references to the war, and both are oblique. I'll give you a sense of the highlights to give you a flavor of what they talked about. I mean, I find this very interesting. Many of you served or are serving on the board. Oh, it's difficult. There are always challenges, finances, issues. But it's interesting to me to go back 150 years and see 175 years. Most deal with, surprise, finances, high holiday seats, fees, and salaries, but also about membership and a controversy, of course, with who would there be controversy with? Someone want to guess? Who do boards have controversy with? Then and now. Oh, come on, be brave.
The rabbi.
Oh, thank you. Yes. And of course, you look back and you say, yes, nothing changes. And yet it's quite different. It was a time of institutional surviving and persevering. In the US military, there were a handful of exceptions. No Jewish chaplains. There were Jews, but no Jewish chaplains. There was no legal impediment. So Southern Jewish laymen ministered to Jewish soldiers. There was Reverend Michelbacher and Reverend George James. I use the term reverend. They were not rabbis, but they were educated laymen empowered to lead the congregations. They were lay rabbis of Richmond, and they functioned as chaplains, as did a Uriah Feebleman of Petersburg, Virginia, and Dean Nordingler of Macon, Georgia. Privates who functioned unofficially as Jewish chaplains. Now, those who served in the military often know that there are often uncommissioned, but sometimes sergeants ranks who assist the chaplain. They're chaplain's assistants, and when the chaplain can't be there, they fill in, and they're like the ritual chair, the shamas, the substitute rabbi, the balkar. Put a lot of titles on, but basically they help deliver Jewish services, and that's what they had at the time. Reverend Michelbacher, unofficially as Jewish chaplains, he's known for writing the prayer of the Confederate States soldier that opened with the Shema and connected ancient Jewish imagery with the Confederacy and linked Jewish soldiers with the Southern call. I should reproduce it, but I'm not sure that it's what every country does. You know, I always marvel how, if you've read the military books, that, God bless America and our country and our freedom and our flag, and yet there were Jews in the German army in World War I, and they also prayed to God and prayed the Shema and tied it to the Kaiser and company. So that's a whole other conversation if you want to have it. But the point here we're driving at is, how did Jews manage to get their spiritual needs met in small numbers? In short, they did whatever they could wherever they were. In other words, they improvised. Those who knew the service would step forward as groups of Jews sought each other out for Shabbat or holidays. And many people have reported to me they've gone on cruises and it's Shabbat. And maybe the cruise company will have a book or a room, or several Jews will get together and try to have a conversation, light a candle, whatever. And the experience is, as people told me, that even though they don't go as regularly at home, they felt they needed, because the opportunity was there, they really needed to preserve that so it would be available for other Jews. One Union soldier wrote in the Jewish Messenger that Jewish men in his outfit would meet in some secluded spot on the outskirts of camp for Shabbat worship, which was also typical in other outfits. The men of the 13th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry Regiment organized even more formally and even held meetings. They made hospital visits and arranged for a traditional burial when a comrade was killed and read the service themselves. Their chairman, Auerbach, requested help from Isaac Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism, to obtain prayer books and tefillin and taluses, as well as copies of the Israelite publication. That was the newsletter he wrote. If you recall, when we began last time, I mentioned how many of the rabbis had their own little, the equivalent of websites today, but they had their own newsletters and their own news, I won't say paper, but they were kind of editorial magazines. And that was because Jewish troops, he said, were, quote, tired of reading the Evangelist and others. And of course, those soldiers closer to cities might get a short furlough, or at least be able to procure holiday foods or prayer books. Often the soldiers do not know the exact date of the holiday, but they did their best. Jay Levy wrote his sister about celebrating Passover at Adams Group, South Carolina. Zeke purchased matzot, he said, in Charleston, to last us for the week. We are observing the festival in a truly Orthodox style. On the first day, we had a fine vegetable soup. It was made of a bunch of vegetables that Zeke brought from Charleston, containing new onions, parsley, carrots, turnip, and a young cauliflower. Also, a pound and a half of fresh beef at $4 a pound. Now, there was a lot of inflation going on back then. After the capture of Memphis, Tennessee, Jewish men with the Union Army were delighted to learn that there were 2 synagogues in that city where they could attend services on Shabbat and festivals. Lieutenant Simon Bruckner of the 39th Illinois Volunteer Regiment, stationed in nearby Norfolk, Virginia, he took time off and went to the synagogue for Rosh Hashanah of 1862 at his mother's urging. He recalled loving the familiar chanting of the minister, that was the title that the non-rabbis used, but found the local Jews embittered against Northern soldiers. Although most everyone treated him with courtesy and 3 families with friendliness, young ladies were often very difficult. Why do you think that was? I can't hear. Oh, Andy, you want to speak?
Did you say the young ladies were difficult?
Yes.
Oh, well, because you never trust a man in a uniform. He's going to leave you.
Okay, that's one explanation. Is on the other hand, I think, and this is not from Rosen or the other sources, I think that part of that was because many of them had sweethearts, Confederate sweethearts, Jewish men and cousins. They'd lost them. And it's like any country or any group that's been occupied, they're not going to want to see the uniform, not because they won't leave them, but because they don't leave them. It should be there to begin with. So there is some hostility, and there is some genuine loss in many instances. Wendy, did you want to respond?
Do you know when the Jewish Welfare Board was started?
No, I don't, but we can certainly look that up. I think
Because
it's later, much later, like 1880s, perhaps 1890. It was maybe 1900s. It was not in this period. Why do you ask?
No, because the Jewish Welfare Board provided books and all sorts of things, and they had Jewish lay leaders, of which my husband was one.
But this is much later.
Oh,
So
definitely much
that's-
later.
And see, that's, I'm glad you brought that up.
But it
because-
hasn't changed somewhat. I mean, we have more soldiers now. The soldiers and sailors, Marines, and
Right.
whoever else, the airmen, they're stationed all over the world, and there is a shortage of Jewish chaplains. So I know when my husband was the lay leader and he went to sea for 4 months, he did sometimes the Catholic services.
Right.
He gave the last rites to people. He was they had like a short course where they
Right.
gave them the books and told them what to do. So,
Right, exactly. And that is exactly what I was referring to, that there was no established institutional Judaism. There was no Jewish Welfare Board. There was no Shaliach, there was no Israel. I mean, there was nothing, virtually nothing, very, very little institutional support. And so they had to improvise and do this. Whereas today, we do have, even if it's not perfect, most Jewish soldiers and chaplains are sent to the major Jewish centers. But again, depending on your specialty, different service people have to go to different places. John wants to speak. Unmute, John.
Okay, there we go. Getting used to a new computer.
Ah,
You raised an excellent point earlier on. I want to build on that idea, because going to your comment about the young ladies not necessarily wanting to cooperate with the soldier from the other side, but the idea of putting our current values on older generations, because most people in 1860, 1870, few if anybody traveled much past 30 miles past where they were born. Most people had very little contact with their government unless you lived in a port city or in a major city where you dealt with the government. So their loyalties tended to be to their states and localities.
right.
They identified with their local communities. I mean, think about travel today and then travel back then.
Goodness.
And then the whole thing that, and there's a document I have somewhere in my files, my stepson found to me, of how we've changed the way we speak about our country. Prior, around the Civil War to maybe about the early 1900s, people said the United States are. They said it in everyday speech. They said it in publications, and you can track this. People have actually looked at the documents. And over time, it's changed to the United States is, which is more of a singular idea. So they thought differently. They saw themselves as Americans, but they identified with their localities. That's the
Oh,
observation.
yeah, and even especially with this period, the Civil War, with the states. So Lee decided he was conflicted, and
Mhm.
but his native Virginia, he was a Virginian. You were a North New Hampshireite. You first, and then the states was more than the Confederation, but it was a secondary level. It's not like it is today, where Americans who happen to live in the Midwest or on the West Coast or in the Southeast. Florida is a little bit of an exception. There is some sociology that somebody who has the tools to do it. People in Alabama love to talk about how they're from Alabama, 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 Alabama. Not quite the same in Georgia. And I think we too, and for other reasons, we're Floridians. People come here, in huge numbers, and it's its own identity, like California used to be. But we're getting into sociology. Let me get back to the Civil War. Okay, so we're talking about young ladies. Meyer Levy of Philadelphia was walking in a small Virginia town that had been captured by the Federals around Passover time. He saw a small boy on the stairs eating matzah. When he asked the boy for a piece, the child fled inside, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Mother, there's a damn Yankee Jew outside." The mother came out, immediately invited him to Passover dinner that night. Interesting. Henry Frank and Isaac Lowenberg were with the occupying Union Army, and they stopped into John Mayer's store in Vicksburg, Mississippi. They identified themselves as Jews and inquired about religious services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. John Mayer was president of the congregation Anshe Chesed, so small that it held services on the second floor of the engine house, firehouse. And the boys were invited to worship with them. They came to the Mayer home often, and by the end of the war, Isaac had convinced Mayer's daughter, Ophelia, to marry him, despite her strong prejudices against the Yankee Yehudim, the Yankee Jews. So that probably worked both ways. With Passover and High Holy Days approaching, Reverend Michelbacher of Richmond asked the commanding Confederate generals to grant leave for Jewish soldiers in the Virginia area so they could attend services. Both Grant and Beauregard had to reject the request on grounds of military necessity, but left open the option for individual leave through application to commanding officer. That's not my definition of anti-Semitism, and it was military, as you know. Virginia was a real constant hotspot in the military confrontations of the war, and the South lost a lot of people, as did the North. So it was not by any way saying we're not going to let Jews pray. This was not Pharaoh saying you can't go worship your God. In fact, many individual Jews were able to. So that's just a point. The Union troops, the Union troops near Baltimore were more fortunate. Rabbi Zoll requested and General Tyler granted furloughs for the High Holy Days, and Jewish soldiers were taken home for festive dinners on Rosh Hashanah and break the fast on Yom Kippur by members of Baltimore congregation. There were more soldiers, there were more Jews, and they weren't doing much battle in Maryland till Antietam. For one pious young soldier was on the line of battle near Harper's Ferry on Yom Kippur in 1861. Fight he must, but he did not have to violate the commandment to fast. So he fasted while fighting, and when the enemy retreated in the late afternoon, he went into the woods and recited his prayers until sunset signaled the end of the day. You got to admire that. Yeah, I think that's extraordinary. Many did not or could not keep even the semblance of dietary laws, but Rosen reported about one devout Jew from Arkansas who somehow throughout the war did. Some Jewish soldiers did not observe or even identify as Jews, but many did. Very much like today in some ways. Captain Marcus Hoffman of the 4th North Carolina told of a Yom Kippur service held in a tent in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862, right after Antietam. Stonewall Jackson, a student of religion, is believed to observe part of the service. So there was an openness alongside of mixed feelings about Jews in the South and definitely in the North. A couple more of these. George Kuhn, a private of the 118th Pennsylvania Volunteers, was one of 5 deserters sentenced to be shot on August 1863. Rabbi Zoll of Baltimore was called to Rappahannock Station, where the regiment was stationed, as there was no closer rabbi. Zoll appealed to Lincoln and to General Meade, but the boy was guilty and could not be pardoned. The rabbi stood by the regimental Protestant chaplain and Catholic priest from Washington as they each prayed with the condemned. With the rabbi, Kuhn recited Psalms and Yigdal and Shema, and at 3 p.m. the clergy were asked to conclude their prayers and move aside. As 36 muskets executed the 5, whose bodies were then placed in the graves, and the 3 clergy, side by side, each read their burial service. Dr. Bert Korn speculates that, quote, this was probably the first case in American history of an all-denominational funeral, unquote. Interesting. What do you think about that? And yeah, there were, I guess, a small number of Jewish deserters. There were deserters. Bob?
Was there a breakdown between Reform, Conservative, Orthodox? It wasn't a breakdown back then, I guess.
There were Orthodox Jews, but they did not have a movement. They did not have a denomination. They were just Orthodox. There was no chief rabbi, there was no yeshiva, there was no vad, and there was no conservative movement. That didn't come about till late 1870s, 1880s. There was no conservative movement. So there were traditional Jews, there were a few Reform congregations, and a lot of folks in between. So you just had to manage the best they could.
Right. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, we now come to the concluding issue, the chaplaincy controversy. Prior to Civil War, there is no trace of any discussion about Jewish chaplains. There weren't that many Jews, there weren't that many congregations, there weren't that many Jews in the military. It was very little. Now, a little history. During the Mexican War, President Polk had appointed 2 Catholic priests to serve as the Catholic soldiers. These were civilian appointments. It wasn't until the Civil War the Catholic chaplains were military appointments. In the South, the requirements stated only clergymen. But there were insufficient Jews in any regiment to warrant the appointment of a Jewish chaplain. The original bill before Congress provided that chaplains were to be appointed by the regimental commander on the vote of the field officers and company commanders, and, quote, be regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination, unquote. Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham, on his own initiative and without Jewish prompting, spoke out clearly in defense of Jewish rights. But his colleagues ignored him, and the bill passed. Isaac M. Wise, founder of Reform Judaism, immediately grasped the situation. He labeled the qualification an unquote, an unjust violation of our constitutional rights, unquote. 3 months later, in September 1861, just prior to the war, a YMCA worker visited the military camp in Virginia where the 65th Regiment of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry was stationed, was horrified to discover that Michael Allen of Philadelphia was serving as the regimental chaplain. He created a fuss in the paper such that Assistant Adjutant General of the Army Ruggles had to state in writing that only regularly ordained Christian clergy could serve as chaplains. Allen resigned his commission on the excuse of ill health rather than suffer humiliation. He had been well trained and well respected. The commanding officer, Colonel Max Friedman, and a large portion of officers and 1,200 men were Jewish. Further, during his 2 months of service, he was not a Jewish chaplain, a chaplain for all. And as Wendy was mentioning, he gave Sunday sermon services on universal topics like ethics and morality, faith and fear, doubt, and so on. So he served as a chaplain. You know, in the Army and in the Air Force, chaplains are denominational. And a Protestant chaplain will have a cross, and a rabbi will have a tablet, but not in the U.S. Navy. In the Navy, you are appointed a chaplain. And while, yes, your primary community is where you'll be working and functioning and stationing, you are a chaplain for all naval personnel. And again, to underscore what Wendy said, the chaplains, and I've known several, yeah, they've done Catholic funerals on the battlefield and last rites and Thanksgiving services, and just the military has done a very, very good job in interfaith relations and in functioning. Now, many chaplains were not of the highest caliber. The Paymaster General of the Army told of one regiment that employs a French cook and musters him as chaplain to meet the expense. And the concept of universal religious rights just hadn't taken hold in America yet. In Carl Sandburg's book on Lincoln, he told of a visiting delegation of clergy from Philadelphia who urged Lincoln not to appoint a certain Universalist, that's like Unitarian minister, as a chaplain. Because, quote, that man believes that even rebels themselves will be finally saved, unquote. So I guess his theology was politicized. Colonel Freeman resolved to try again. They realized that to challenge the law as written to allow a Jewish chaplain would require a candidate who was ordained, as Allen had not been. So they elected a civilian, a Reverend Arnold Fischel of Shareth, Israel, New York, a student of American Jewish history, well respected, and he accepted only because this was to be a test case. The Secretary of War rejected his application cordially because of the discrimination clause. I had spoken briefly about the three-pronged campaign by American Jews to get the law changed. A publicity campaign, a petition campaign, and a lobbyist to Congress. And I'm going to kind of spell that out because I think there's a message for us today. Publicity. Isaac Wise politicized this and blamed the Republicans. There were Republicans and Whigs and Democrats back then, citing separation of church and state. His most effective argument was that Jews fight and die in battle, then why should rabbis who might apply for military commissions be denied? Still a powerful argument. Rabbi Leeser emphasized the needs of Jewish soldiers for pastoral comfort, argued that if this law stood, the implication was that Jews could be excluded from appointment to any federal office. It's not supposed to be a religious test. So it isn't just, well, a handful of chaplains, or maybe a little more than a handful. If you have that law and that precedent, then Jews can be excluded from anything else. The Jewish press did not blame Congress, but emphasized equal and fair treatment under the law. Fundamentalists then, probably now, disagreed vehemently. The presbyter argued, quote, imagine the effect of granting the privilege of chaplaincy service to Jewish rabbis, Mormon debaucherers, Chinese priests, and Indian conjurers, unquote. You know, the argument, you let Jews in, then you're going to have all these other religions, and then what's going to happen? The secular press did not agree with the narrow sectarian view. The Baltimore Clipper took a strongly pro-Jewish position in the name of democracy and pointed out that only 18 months before, Congress had invited a rabbi to open a house session with prayer. According to Dr. Korn, the petition campaign was very effective because of its moderate tone and cautious wording. 7 were presented by senators and representatives from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Illinois alone. Most were signed by Christians as well as Jews. In Maryland, Friedenreich of Baltimore secured 700 signatures of Christians. 38 Maryland legislators petitioned Congress to make the change. Leopold Kind obtained 200 endorsements in town, though at the time there were only 3 Jewish residents in Bangor, Maine. So again, we learn the value of allies, of moderate tone, of publicizing, and of making appeals to fair and ethical treatment. The Board of Delegates of American Israelites appointed Reverend Arnold Fischel to act as a civilian chaplain and representative, that is, a lobbyist. Through his powerful Republican contacts, Fischel, in fact, did secure an interview with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln admitted the rightness of his cause, but could not appoint permanent chaplains over Congress's current law. But what Lincoln did was submit a bill to Congress covering military subjects including the chaplaincy issue. Indiana Representative Holman introduced legislation on December 20th, and it easily passed. However, Congress had a dilemma. They couldn't easily reject the earlier law without offending constituents as a rejection of Christianity. If any of this sounds familiar, if any of these tones or issues, it's because, yeah, history repeats itself. So they compromised. They referred to the earlier bill, adding, shall hereafter be construed to read as follows, that no person shall be appointed a chaplain in the U.S. Army that is not a regularly ordained minister of some religious denomination, unquote. They just interpreted Christian denomination to religious denomination. It didn't become law until 1862, and there were further amendments specifying specifically the Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish religions, in addition to requiring ecclesiastical endorsement. And that's true today. You cannot be a chaplain unless your denomination sponsors or endorses you. Look, there's so much more. There's so much more to this. Jews then served as regimental, or more often hospital chaplains, and their experiences and the stories. But the lesson, the takeaway from this chaplaincy controversy is that we Jews of all stripes and persuasions have to be vigilant to protect our legal and civil rights by standing up and working effectively and in tandem with allies, Jewish or Christian or Muslim or what have you, for common principles whenever we can. Not only because it's right and it's the Jewish value, but because when we need support, it will be there for us. Because that, in my view, is the way we should do things in America. Questions, comments? Yes, Bob.
So if a soldier it's a Jewish soldier and he wanted a rabbi, could he get a rabbi, or would he just get a regular clergy back then?
There weren't any rabbis.
There wasn't any, okay, there weren't any rabbis, okay.
There weren't. And if there were, they may not be around, but it took all of this and with Congress and Lincoln and all to get the law changed so that there could be officially endorsed Jewish chaplains like they had just done for Catholic chaplains, and of course, Protestants. So, but the lesson was how it was done, how it was managed without turning the evangelical community on its high horse. John?
Well, considering a more recent example of the same problem, and I cannot recall the rabbi's name, there was some controversy involving a Jewish chaplain, the first Jewish chaplain in the Marine Corps during World War II, and services, and I forget which particular island. This was after one of the nasty campaigns in the Pacific, and they were opening the cemetery, and they asked him to present for everybody, not just Jews. And of course, several Christian ministers refused to have anything to do with it as violating their principles, but he did get some support. And I wish I could recall his name, and I'll probably remember it at midnight tonight.
I know who it was. I believe they're talking about Rabbi Roland Gittleson, who was the rabbi in Temple Israel in Boston.
Yes, couldn't remember.
And he was there with the raising of the flag, and it was Iwo Jima, John.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't remember.
And yeah, and then they wouldn't permit, for, if I recall, his sermon, which was beautifully done.
Yes, it was.
Because it was fire. They can't have a rabbi, can't have a Jew telling everybody what's going on here. But somebody in the department, one of the higher up generals, I don't recall the specific, got it disseminated, and it was published everywhere. And it got out not just in the military, but all over the country. That was my recollection. Yeah. So.
And I'm losing names, and I'm sorry Ed Mallow's not here because he could correct me. But I had the privilege of meeting a Jewish chaplain a few years ago who started his career in the Navy during the Vietnam War, and he is apparently the only Jewish chaplain to ever have what they call a surface warfare rating. He was Black Shoe Navy. He served in swift boats.
Hmm.
And I cannot recall his name, but he was also the first clergyman into the barracks in Beirut in 1983.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He was still on active duty at the time.
Very interesting.
But,
Very,
but he went to seminary after he left Vietnam.
interesting. Well, many times through the years, I served when I was in Hagerstown at the VA in, well, where is that town? South of Hagerstown. And there's a big VA facility there. And I went one day every week for a couple of years. And it's the stories I heard. And in my rabbinate from different people who had served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, over and over again, how the Protestant chaplain, the Catholic priest was so solicitous, so friendly, so helpful. There wasn't a rabbi. The rabbi was there. The rabbi was being transferred. They were in between, whatever it was. And even more so in my interfaith work in churches, how many Christians came to me and said, when I was serving in the Marines or in the Air Force, they had a rabbi and we got to talk and he was so helpful. And I was having problems with my marriage and he was listening to us. It's a real good experiences and across denominational lines. It's been very inspirational and very affirmative and very positive. And I think it's a story that one of the chaplains ought to be writing, as well as like the story you've told or about Kittleson. It's because it's essential when you're in the military and you're serving, it's hard enough. And it's good to have all the support you can. Yes, Mr. Nachman.
Yes, we recall with some pride in our congregation that Rabbi Sidney Lefkowitz, as a chaplain, performed the first Jewish service in Germany after the
I'm not hearing. We lost it after Germany.
It was when the camps were liberated.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. He faded out.
Which did a service in the Siegfried line. And it's actually NBC has a recording of it.
And,
Really?
there's a film of it.
Yeah, there's
GI
film.
Jews.
And you do have one in the Temple Library, in the archives?
I don't know, but I've seen the film.
There's a documentary called GI Jews that has it.
On radio.
Oh, that'd be very interesting. Is it like an hour and a half? What, short, long?
It's not that long. Well, I don't know about the other, but his speech is not that long.
Okay.
And
Good.
so, Rabbi,
Yes, Linda.
you're familiar, I'm sure, with the 4 chaplains who went down with the Dorchester.
Yes.
So I thought that was,
part of
with the
Yeah,
different
part of it.
denominations, how they gave up their life jackets for others, and they just went down arm in arm singing. I thought that was special.
Interesting. I of course learned that and heard about it. But when I was younger, I collected stamps, and there was a commemorative postage stamps to the 4 chaplains.
Yeah, a 3-cent stamp. I saw it online.
No, this was an older stamp. This
Yeah,
must be a re-release.
This says the Immortal Chaplains, Interfaith in Action, 3 cents, United States postage. So I don't know when that was issued, but
Well, if it was 3 cents, it wasn't very
a long time ago.
I know. Yeah, that was inspirational as well. Yeah, a lot of important stories. And
Well, Temple University has the Chapel of the 4 Chaplains, which is their memorial.
Mhm.
well, is there any other issues? We're going to have more fun in 2 weeks. I'm going to have some wonderful little stories for you. But yeah, slavery was an issue. The reading a lot about this, some background reading, that as long as they were able to go along and compromise from 1820 with the Missouri-Maine deal, Missouri would come in slave, Maine would come in free. Kansas, Nebraska, the compromise of 1850, had a group of leaders. I think we talked a little bit about it, the Whigs and the Clay and Webster and those people. And they were able to cobble together enough temporary solutions to allow them to stay out of war. But then the abolitionists became very, very, obviously, very committed and strident and said, you know, it's not just about land, it's about lives and it's about morality. And so they really pushed the envelope. And, you know, the Southerners said, and some to this day, why don't they just leave us alone? Let us do our thing. You know, they shouldn't invade us. They shouldn't try to change us. We do our thing. But it wasn't working. And it was a horrible, horrible, terrible conflict. Militarily, my son knows a good deal about these sorts of things, is that the technology of war, the weaponry, the rifle, the barrel rifling was deadly, and the tactics hadn't kept up with it. They still had these frontal assaults. You know anything about the battle at Gettysburg? You know, waves of Confederates would come and they'd be mowed down, and they just ran out of people. You know, the desperate charge of the Virginians across the field. And so there were a lot of things that were very ugly and horrible. And we can glorify the bravery, but not the horror. So there are lessons, perhaps. John?
All right, thank you. You're stimulating a lot of thinking tonight. I watched that program on HGTV called Hometown, and most people don't realize that Laurel, Mississippi is in Jones County, Mississippi. And most people don't know about the Jones County War.
Oh, yeah.
You probably heard of that movie, The Kingdom of Jones, that came out a few years ago.
No, that I missed that.
Yeah.
There were at least 7 internal revolts inside the Confederacy against the Confederate States government.
Mhm.
The Jones County War is the most infamous because this was a combination of Confederate deserters and runaway slaves who basically took on the county. And as someone pointed out, it was put down with some second-class fighting and some first-class hangings. But it was a significant event because one of the things that, and you kind of alluded to it, is that the South was not united behind their government in all cases.
No.
In some cases, and in this particular case, there was significant violence in Jones County against the Confederate authorities, and they had to bring troops in to put it down.
Right. And in Eastern Tennessee, I think they had to recall Jackson or Johnson to bring troops in because East Tennessee was not having any interest in what was going on in the Confederacy. They didn't have slaves. They didn't have plantations. They were pro-union. And by the same token, the same thing was true. There was a great deal of resistance to the war and a great deal of anti-Black feeling in New York and in other places. And they didn't want to draft, they didn't want to tax, they didn't want the war, and they weren't in sympathy with the abolitionists. So it's important to understand nuance. It's important to recognize it isn't all this group against all that group. There are always splinters and there are always divisions within a particular position or political group, what have you, as we know today.
So what else is new?
Yeah. I don't know.
I worked in Jones County, Mississippi.
Did you?
Yep. Laurel, yep. 30 miles north of Hattiesburg. And that's where home of Ray Walton, Lillian King Price, Masonite, and Sam H. Bowers, the former Grand Imperial Wizard.
But all.
Yeah. Bowers.
Well, at any rate, I will be seeing you in a couple of weeks, and I am looking forward this year to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Had a conversation with Judy's daughter, who's here visiting. After all, Brady left Boston, and now he goes to Tampa Bay, and they're going to the Super Bowl. And I said, for Bostonians, it's hard, but $50 million is a good paycheck.
Yeah.
I would say.
50
So
million.
I may be very depressed when I speak to you next.
You think you're underpaid now?
Yeah, well,
That proves that.
that's people would say on the marketing and macroeconomic level that it certainly, definitely was a good investment. Tampa hasn't gone to the Super Bowl for what, 20 years or so?
Yep.
Yeah.
I have a
We'll see.
grandson in Boston and my grandson's in Kansas City. Can you picture what that's going to be next week?
As long as they're not getting together for a while, they'll be all right.
You'll be all
That's
right.
that's fun. That kind of competition we can live
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
That's the kind of conflict we can.
So Brady
Yeah.
might get another diamond ring, huh? Sure.
He's running out of fingers, that one.
Yeah, right.
That's all right. It should be fun.
Thank you,
Well,
Rabbi.
Thank you,
I
Rabbi.
want to thank you very much, and I promise you that in 2 weeks, when we conclude, we're going to have some fun stories for you. So thank you for your
We'll be here.
participation.
Thanks,
This has
Rabbi.
been really interesting.
Very-
I enjoyed it. Take care now.
Okay, Rabbi. Thank you.
Be well.
Wendy.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. I have a personal story.
I'm gonna get going.